The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show. I'm Charles Christian and thank you very much for listening in again. Our big interview this week is with Irish filmmaker Jason Figgis, who will be talking about the movies and documentaries he's made, along with what fascinates him about horror movies and the supernatural. And we also get to hear some of his own ghostly and paranormal experiences. But first, we head up to the north of England to learn about a curious incident. Sounds like something out of a gothic horror novel involving the Manchester Mummy. By way of an interlude here on Weird Tales Radio Show, let me introduce you to the curious case of Hannah Beswick, the Manchester Mummy. Now, back in the mid-18th century in England, there was an upsurge in concerns about being mistakenly buried alive and much debate about the uncertainty of signs of death. Various suggestions were made to test for signs of life before burial, including pouring vinegar and pepper into the corpse's mouth and even applying red-hot pokers to the feet or even more sensitive parts of the body. Writing as late as 1895, one physician claimed that as many as 2,700 people were buried prematurely each year in England and Wales, although others estimate the figure to be closer to 800. Still 800 too many. Anyway, let's go back to Hannah Beswick. She was born in 1688, and she was the daughter of John and Patience Beswick of Chetwood Old Hall in Manchester. And she inherited a considerable wealth from her father, who died in 1706. Now, some years before her own death, one of Hannah's brothers, John, had shown signs of life just as his coffin lid was about to be closed. Obviously, they thought he was dead, and a mourner noticed that John's eyelids appeared to be flickering. On examination by the family physician, Dr. Charles White, he confirmed that John was very much still alive. Now, John regained full consciousness in a matter of days and lived on for many more years before he properly died. Only person to go to his own funeral twice, I'm guessing. Anyway, although her brother lived a normal life, the unsettling incident instilled a fairly dramatic mortal terror in Hannah. She was really, really worried about being buried alive. To the point of being morbidly obsessed with it. And she specifically instructed the family physician, that's Dr. Charles White again, that in the event of her death, her corpse was to be kept above ground in a ventilated place, good move, and regularly examined for any signs of life. And only once she was definitely found to be dead, the term is irrevocably and unmistakably dead, was she to be buried. Fair enough, you might think, but we have to deal with the character of Dr. Charles White. Now, Hannah died in 1758, and although there is no mention in her will of her wanting to be embalmed, just about leaving her body above ground until she was obviously dead, Dr. Charles White was unable to resist the temptation to add a fresh mummy to his collection of curiosities and unilaterally made the decision to embalm her. Yes, seriously. White had developed a particular interest in anatomy while studying medicine in London and was building up a collection of curiosities, which by the time of his death also included the skeleton of a highwayman who'd been hanged for burglary. So, he mummified Hannah Beswick, drained all the blood out of her, took her organs out, replaced them with tar and saltpeter and things of that nature, and generally desiccated and mummified her. And initially, her mummified body was kept at Ancoats Hall, which is a home of another member of the Beswick family, but was soon moved to a room in Dr. White's home in Manchester, where it was stored in an old clock case. Oh, very, very tasteful. Following White's death in 1813, Beswick's body was bequeathed to a Dr. Ollier, and on his death in 1828, it was donated to the Museum of the Manchester Natural History Society, where she became known as the Manchester Mummy. She was displayed in the museum's entrance hall next to a Peruvian mummy and an Egyptian mummy. Apparently, her relatives were allowed free access to visit her whenever they wished. I can't imagine them taking that up too often. She was described by a visitor in 1844 as one of the most remarkable objects in the museum. It possibly doesn't say much for the rest of the museum. And while there are no pictures of Hannah Beswick, a local historian of the time said her body was well preserved, although the face was shriveled and black. The mummy was kept in a glass case, coffin-shaped case as well. Anyway, shortly after the museums transferred to Manchester University in 1867, it was finally decided that Beswick was irrevocably and unmistakably dead, and that the time had come for her to receive a proper burial. And so she was finally interred in an unmarked grave. This was because there were concerns people might rob the grave and recover the mummy. In July 1868, more than 110 years after her death. May you rest in peace, Hannah Beswick. As for Dr. Charles White, well, And now, here's our interview with Jason Figgis.
My name is Jason Figgis, and I'm a filmmaker, photographer, and screenwriter over various different genres. So there's never a dull moment.
And I think it's probably fair to say you are based in Ireland.
I'm based in Ireland, actually right on the border, literally on the border between County Dublin and County Wicklow.
Right.
On the coast, so 5 minutes from the sea, and very close to Dalkey and Killiney, some of the most beautiful parts of Dublin. So it means if one ever needs inspiration, you walk 5 minutes outside your door, go through Shanghana Park, and the world is your oyster in a way in terms of any kind of creative spark coming to you. It's a really beautiful place to be.
Yeah, sounds lovely. Does it rain a lot there? I remember once interviewing a guy from Dublin, and he said, we have a soft climate over here, which was a sort of a euphemism for it rains a lot.
It's definitely a euphemism for that. Well, funnily enough, we would have a period of time where it might rain for 3 or 4 days, but then for a huge portion of each day, you get really nice sunshine. So you can really, take advantage of that and get out and about. But I said, particularly if you live where we live, right on the border of Wicklow, which is known as the Garden of Ireland, you're in a perfect area. So, once the rain stops, get out. You get a few hours out there and then get back in as the storm clouds roll in again.
Well, wonderful. Right, let's talk about some of your recent projects or current projects. You've got a movie, I think, coming out soon or in final stages of production called Winifred Meeks.
Correct.
And you've also done some work on Simon Marsden and also Norman J. Warren.
That's absolutely. They're the 3 projects that are currently getting finalized. So Norman J. Warren, I've known him for a little while, and we're hoping to collaborate on a feature-length documentary looking at his life and work, but particularly behind the man himself. I'm more interested in that. those who are fans of his work know his work. So if we're going to take a documentary approach, let's look at the man himself and what his interests are and what made him go down the route of becoming a genre filmmaker. I like the idea of, discovering what makes somebody tick, and it may be something completely different. He might be football mad,
Yes.
and that's a massive part of his life, but he also loves horror. So I think, genre filmmakers tend to be pigeonholed as just being this kind of moody character that lives in a garret, and has no friends. And usually it's the opposite to that they tend to be quite gregarious, intelligent people, but they realize that there's a market out there as a businessman for that kind of work. And if they're artistic, then they can cut out an interesting niche for themselves.
Yeah.
So with Norman J. Warren, I've always been a fan of his work because, like Pete Walker, he very much carved out an interesting niche within the genre, and just added an extra kind of touch of atmosphere, and sometimes very gruesome, but never overly gruesome. If he had a gruesome scene, it was for a very particular reason, and it was sporadic. You never, expected the next scene was going to be horrific. So when the horror came, it was even more shocking. And I think that's a very clever device to use in film. A classic example of that being Almodovar's. Sorry, not Almodovar. I'm always saying that. Guillermo del Toro's film Pan's Labyrinth, when the young man is killed by the German officer with the bottle of wine, smashing it into his face. He never does another violent act in the film, but every time you see him, you're terrified of him because he's subject to extremes. So with Norman J. Warren, it's the same kind of thing, and the same with Pete Walker. Where there's violence, it's disturbing, but it feels like it's really part of the narrative as opposed to just being there for shock value. Mm-hmm. So Norman and I, as I said, we've become friends over the last couple of years. And I just said to him, look, I'd really like to collaborate on a book with you called Terror, in conversation with Norman J. Warren. So I literally, something similar to what we're doing here today, I called him up and I recorded him, not knowing how much material I would get. And we ended up speaking literally without a break for about 3 or 4 hours, which has now become the material for the book, along with a lot of drawings of scenes from his different productions, as opposed to just stills. We wanted to take a kind of an artistic approach to it. So that's going to come out this year. We haven't approached a publisher yet, but there's a lot of publishers in the UK who are interested in that particular period of British horror, which was a kind of a golden era, the 70s in the UK. So we're kind of looking forward to finishing that up. So that'll be a fun one.
Yeah, for people.
And again, it's moving. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, for people who aren't familiar with his work, name some of his movies.
Okay, well, Inseminoid would be the most famous of them, with Judy Geeson and Stephanie Beecham, which was a sci-fi film, which unfortunately for Norman came out around the same time as Alien, and he was accused of stealing ideas from Alien, but he actually knew nothing about the production at the time when he was making his film. So it's one of those very strange, synchronous things where films are made side by side. Neither production know what's going on with the other, but they end up doing quite similar things. And as you know, that's happened a lot over the years. It also happened with Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and also at the same time, Patrick Bergin was doing an excellent Robin Hood with Uma Thurman, which didn't get a look in because Bryan Adams stayed in the charts for 18 years. So
he's still there, I think.
He's still there with that song. I wouldn't be surprised. But taking nothing away from Bryan Adams, but a talented man. Inseminoid would be his most famous. Then going back earlier in his career, you had films like Prey, again, which was a science fiction film, but very much based terrestrially in rural England. So it had a kind of a bucolic feel to it, and then just something really nasty appears, within the serenity of the English countryside. So again, that'd be an example of what he would do. Something quite normal, and then, wait a minute, there's an unease there. Well, what's this? Who is this person? Entered into this idyll and created mayhem. So that's another one that's very atmospheric. And then another one he did, which I particularly like as well, is Terror, which was about resurrecting an ancient witch, just a kind of a primal evil force, and how, even those who bring this evil into the world are subject to horrific outcomes, for themselves, even though they consider themselves servants of this creature.
Yes.
So things like that again. But I think, that film was also set in a contemporary London, a swinging London of the 70s. I know they normally say the swinging 60s, let's face it,
Yeah.
I think London was swinging a lot in the 70s as well, especially with the flares.
Yes.
So it's always a great look. So again, he's always created films that have that touch of reality because they're based at a particular time that people were living and experiencing these type of films and that type of culture, but also the atmosphere and just something not quite right.
Yeah.
So that's what makes me particularly enjoy his work. The same as Pete Walker, as I said, Pete Walker would be along the same lines as that, reality mixed with some brutal horror. So yes, I particularly like his work. So people should look him up, In fact, there is a renaissance of his work. And I don't know why I didn't think of that. And all of his films have been re-released on Blu-ray in an incredible box set. I can't remember the name of the company that have released it, but it's really amazing with the ridiculous amount of extras, interviews, documentaries, never before seen footage, galleries, you name it. So anyone interested in British horror, during that period, this is, something incredible to have. But they've only done 1,000 boxes. So when it goes, it goes.
Yeah.
It goes. It's well worth having that really amazing package.
Yeah. And tell us now about the Simon Marsden project.
Simon, that goes kind of way back for me. I was a huge fan of Simon Marsden from the early 90s, and I used to go to our national news agency called Eason. I'd go in there and they had comfy armchairs, and I saw these incredible coffee table books of this amazing photographer called Sir Simon Marsden from Hainton in Lincolnshire. And he was doing infrared photography. But even though it had been, that had come about many years before, somehow he had his own particular talent had made it something very unique that nobody has really been able to emulate since. There are still good, infrared photographers out there, but when you see a Marsden picture, it's Marsden. And again, he had that particular thing. So I was loving these books, The Haunted Realm, Venice, City of Haunting Dreams, and all these incredible books. And I just decided one day that I was going to write to his agent and write a really long, almost like a love letter to Simon because I loved his work so much. It really was. It was crazy. And page after page, back in the day when people actually sat down with paper and a pen and actually wrote something, as opposed to trying to find an email address. So I literally sent to Curtis Brown, to his agent, and 2 weeks later, I'm walking down Palmerston Street, which is glorious Georgian street, tree-lined in Dublin. And I got a phone call, and I answer the phone. It's like this incredibly deep, sonorous, beautifully, immaculate English voice saying, "Is this Jason Figgis?" And I'm like, "Yeah," thinking, "What have I done?" It sounds very official. And he goes, "This is Simon Marsden here." And I couldn't believe it. I said, "Yeah, sure it is." And he goes, "No, seriously, it is. I got your letter and I was moved by it. And I said, are you interested in?" Basically what he said was, "I'm doing a new book and a lot of it covers Ireland." And he said, "Would you be interested in doing a bit of research for me? Because the last time I was in Ireland, when I went to a lot of these places, I was shot at by the landowners because they saw me as a bloody Englishman, coming onto Irish soil, And I said, "Well, the climate has changed hugely, Simon. If I went to any of these houses and said, 'Sir Simon Marsden would like to come and photograph,' they would lay out the red carpet." So I said, "Fear not." So I said, "Give me a list of places that you want me to look at and I'll go." So I went and I took photographs and I sent them to him. Again, not by email, stuck in an envelope, posted off to his house. he rang me up and he said, you've got a good eye, actually. He says, you wouldn't make a bad apprentice, And I said, well, that's a massive compliment coming from you, Simon. And he said, listen, are you going to be in England at all? And it just happened to be that I was going to be doing a tour of England with my girlfriend in her car, and we were going to travel around that part of England and start looking at castles and various ruins and abbeys and doing a bit of photography and just making a nice holiday out of it. And en route was Simon's house. So he said, come and stay for 2 or 3 days and hang out. And I was like, she was a fan as well of his work, and we couldn't quite believe it. We thought, bloody hell, It'd be like, somebody who's obsessed with David Bowie being invited by David Bowie into his house, to hang out for a few days. It's the same kind of thing for us.
Yeah.
So we went and we got on extremely well. And then I made the mistake over dinner of saying, I've just started up a film production company. And I was wondering if, when we do this trip around Ireland for this book, if I could film it. And he just looked at me and then went back to eating his dinner, saying nothing. And I thought, oh my God, what have I done? So his wife, Cassie, lovely one, beautiful in every sense, such a lovely person. She said to me afterwards, don't be offended by Simon. You wouldn't believe the amount of people that want to make a film with him and they do nothing. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, let me assure you, if I say it, I mean it. I don't like to get involved in stuff that I don't feel I'll be able to see through, because it just niggles at me. I don't like to start something I can't finish. And she said, well, that's interesting. So we'll leave it to me and I'll have a word with him. And she did. And after he didn't say it again over the couple of days we were there. But then when I went home, I got a phone call a couple of days later. He said, we're doing this thing and it's fabulous that you're going to drive me around and, it's going to be a lot of fun. Why don't you bring that camera along? And he said, just stay out of my way when I'm getting the photographs. And then we, see if we get on doing that. So I did. And he started looking at the footage, loved it. And then he started going, okay, what I'll do is I'll photograph, then I'll reenact what I did so you can film it properly. And it ended up going from there, a film called The Twilight Hour. It ended up getting bought up, distributed to 150 countries worldwide through Discovery Civilizations, and kind of got the ball rolling. But it was only years later, after I made a lot of other kind of B movies, I'd worked a lot with teenagers in summer camps and made films that were never meant to be released, but always somehow got an international release on DVD and video on demand, almost without, it wasn't the intention, but it was something about them that distributors went, oh, we want to put them out. And I went, well, I'm not going to argue with that. But then Simon got really ill, and he emailed me the day before he died, saying that he had been misdiagnosed, and they thought he had asthma, but he actually had a leaking heart valve, and there was nothing they could do for him. And I was literally taken aback. I was like, Jesus, Simon, and he said at the end of the message, lots of love to you and your family. And I thought, is this actually a goodbye email? Mm-hmm. So I emailed him back, heard nothing, and he literally died the next day with his family surrounding him, which was very heartbreaking. He was such a lovely man. But he, strange enough as well, he died on John Hurt's birthday, and John Hurt had collaborated with us on The Twilight Hour. So it was really strange that he would actually die on John Hurt's birthday.
Yes.
So then it just made me think, and, I allowed them their grieving period, and I said to Cassie, I'd love to make a film about Simon's life and work. And she said, oh my God, that's amazing. I don't want anyone else to do it. I want you to do it because you and Simon really understood each other. So I set it in motion. Nikon came on board and they sponsored it. Various producers came on board. We had Grays of Westminster, the exclusive, royally appointed exclusive Nikon distributor in the UK. And people like that just started coming on board. We had a couple of Broadway producers came on board, and everyone wanted to see it happen. So they produced it, made sure that the finance was there to make it happen. And then it ended up premiering at the BFI and got a ton of great reviews. It's available now on Amazon, but it's coming out on DVD in a special edition now in 2020, which is great. And it's called Simon Marsden and Life in Pictures, but they really loved it. I mean, even at the premiere, it was kind of funny. People that I've admired since forever, like Hayley Mills, turned up to the premiere, and I was blown away because, when I was a kid, I wanted to marry her,
Oh, and, funnily enough, so did I.
Well, there you go. Yeah. There you go. I mean, Whistle Down the Wind is one of my
Yeah,
favorite movies of
Castaway
all
was the
time.
movie.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes.
And she's so lovely still. I got to hug and kiss Hayley Mills. I was like, oh my God. And I said that to her. I said, I wanted to hug and kiss you my whole life. And she laughed her head off. And she was so sweet about it, you know. And in her 70s now. And
Yeah.
she was absolutely lovely. She came, she said, and she was so sweet. She said, now, Jason, I can't stay for the Q&A because my son has a premiere also tonight over in the West End. And I thought, and you actually came anyway? And she said, oh, yes, I really wanted to see this. So she did just before the Q&A. She disappeared with her son and waved at me and went off, but wrote me the most incredible emails saying how much she loved the film. And so, you know, that's something I cherish, as you can imagine. And then her son as well, Ace Lawson, who's Lee Lawson's son, and hers, obviously. He wrote me a lovely message as well, saying how much he loved the film as well, because he accompanied his mother. So, you know, it's become a very... it's a good feeling production, you know, where everything about it, there's nothing gloomy about it. Everything's upbeat, and it's like, this is how good Simon was. And it's got a mixture of fans interviewed and then experts in the field of photography and infrared, and then just, you know, people who were kind of an influence on him and helped him out in his career. So it became, John West always says, you know, who's, as you know, is my producing partner now with the company we have called Figgis West. He always said to me, you know, Jason, I like all the films you made, but this is a transition film. It's a different thing, and we're moving into a different area. And I utterly agree with him, because not only did it make me want to turn my back on the horror genre, you know, as in that kind of film making myself, but it made me really think about the kind of stuff that I wanted to do. And the next thing, you know, the other thing that you had mentioned is Winifred Meeks. So this was, you know, my first collaboration with John West professionally, outside of him being an amazing publicist, because he loved the Marsden film so much that he ended up getting like so many glossy magazines with features and newspapers, and it really got out there, and, you know, in a way that I hadn't known that it would, you know. So I said, look, I've got this script for a movie called Winifred Meeks, and I said, I've never really been happy about shooting it in Ireland. Nothing really feels right about shooting it in Ireland. I feel it's an English film because it's inspired by the likes of M.R. James and Charles Dickens and, you know, E.F. Benson and a lot of these great English writers that I admire. And so I said, it feels like an East Anglian kind of film. And he said, well, you know, I live in East Anglia. I said, I live in Suffolk. So why didn't you come and we'll look? And him and his partner, Julie Abbott, they discovered an absolutely perfect house. But I just had to trust him about the house. You know, they videoed it. They couldn't video the interior, but of course, with it being, you know, professionally profiled on different pages for rent, I was able to look at the interior anyway and gauge that it was a really nice place to film. But it wasn't until literally that I arrived nervously for the first day of filming that I realized that not only was it perfect, but it was laid out in exactly the same way that I wrote the screenplay, which was utterly bizarre, with the added bonus of having a cellar, which I hadn't written. And at the end of the film, she has a confrontation with Winifred Meeks in the kitchen, because I never thought I'd get a cellar. So now the confrontation is in the cellar, which, of course, the classic haunted movie trope is the perfect way to end a ghost story, you know? So that worked wonderfully, except for the night that because I wanted to keep the crew incredibly small. I started out as an editor and a cinematographer and a photographer. So I said, I'm going to film this entire film, and I'm also going to do the sound. So we're not going to have any other crew except me. So they were like, Jesus, I mean, who does that on film? Well, oddly enough, Christopher Nolan does that. I mean, he makes a movie as big as Batman, but it's a closed set. He has the cinematographer and the sound guy, and that's it. There isn't a million people standing around with clipboards, you know, just looking on and annoying the actors and getting in their space. So, yeah. So it was exactly the same kind of vibe. Here's Lara Belmont, who's known, you know, for amazing productions at the ITV, BBC, and, you know, big films like Rise of the Foot Soldier, you know, big genre gangster films anyway. And The War Zone, of course, which was her breakout hit, Tim Roth's directorial debut with Ray Winston playing her daughter, and she got so many awards, Critics Circle Award. She was nominated for BAFTA. She won a British Independent Film Award, Best Newcomer. So she was used to being kind of treated, like a bit of a princess on these sets, And so with us, it was real rough and ready. And I said, she had retired from acting pretty much. She had by the time I got to her, she had retired 8 years from acting and was a mother with 3 children, a single mother with 3 children. And doing an incredible job living in her beautiful country house. And I sent her the script, thinking it was first refusal, basically.
Yeah.
Lara's the one that I want to play this role. And about a week later, she got back to me with an email that simply said, "You've just got me out of retirement." And that's all it said, really. And I thought, I guess that means she wants to do it.
Yes.
I've inspired her to work with somebody else and not me, So I rang her and she said, "Jason, I was literally on the edge of my seat reading that. I read it in one sitting and I was on the edge of my seat, and I loved the character of Anna James, the writer. I love the idea of that, she's a writer who is, working on her next book. And every time she goes to write her book, she rents a different property, so she can have a completely different feel every time she writes a new, in this series of books about a girl called Emma Hart. They're kind of young adult fiction.
Yeah.
The Emma Hart mysteries are called. So she loved all that idea, that it was basically she'd be the only person in the movie. But funnily enough, well, you'll see the film and it's, even though she's the only person in it, and of course the ghost, played brilliantly by Julie Abbott, I might add, our locations manager, you still get the sense of a lot of interaction because there's a lot of phone calls. She talks to her wonderful father, played by the brilliant Northern English actor Bill Fellows from Downton Abbey and Broadchurch, and then Sally George from Casualty, and that plays the mum. So there's a real warmth, in those scenes. But I kept them at a distance. I never allowed Lara to be filmed close up, having a cozy conversation. Every time she spoke to somebody, she was down the end of the garden, or she was off in another room. So you could never really see her that well. This idea of there being something always watching. And even though she might have felt comfortable, the audience aren't being allowed to feel comfortable. So, in a way, I could talk about that for hours, so I won't bore you with the whole ins and outs of all of that. But it turned out to be an amazing experience, largely due to the fact that John and Julie really, had their stuff together on this and made it a joy to work on. And then ultimately, Lara Belmont, as I said, who's worked with the best of the best, sent me a message saying it's one of the greatest experiences she's ever had making film. So there's a testament to, people really enjoying what they're doing and having passion for the subject matter as well as the process, and nobody being an idiot about it, nobody being up their own fundaments,
Yeah.
So so a great experience, I have to say. So it's almost done. I'm actually sitting in the studio while we speak right here, and the final little bit of sound design is being finished. And the credits are being laid in, and also your name is being added to those as a thank you. So you're going to be on the rolling credits of Winifred Meeks.
Oh, lovely! Thank you.
So you're very welcome. So that's like anyone who who's helped us out, even talking about it and putting it out there. If they're just in time to have their name in the rolling credits. So it's quite funny. John has even said that to people. Now, if you want to be on let's get this interview now before Jason finishes the film, And they're all kind of like, oh shit, yeah, okay, good. So it's quite funny. But you didn't know that, so you weren't trying to jump in,
No, I did not know that.
So
no.
You certainly didn't.
No.
But it's a great process, yeah.
And what's then the likely release time for it?
Well, how it'll work is once the film is done, John and Julie will screen it, Lara will see it. I've got a few people, from many years of working with them and advising, either I advising them or they advising me on different projects, and that all kind of look at it, and then we decide, where we're going to go with it. So usually we just start hitting people for early reviews, just to get an interest going. and then start sending it to distributors. I mean, there's a huge marketplace at the moment for films about the paranormal because they're constantly being considered sleeper hits. You know, they're like, oh, a ghost story. We didn't expect that to do well, and it always does. And you're kind of like, well, maybe you should start, expecting them to do well, because it's a safe scare as far as I'm concerned, It's not a torture porn nonsense film, where you disgust it leaving the cinema and never want to see it again. It's the kind of film where you hope people might recommend to their friends and go, oh, this is really creepy. You should watch it, But it is that safe, you might laugh out loud at a scary moment and then feel good about the fact that you lost yourself for that moment, but you would not walk out of the cinema feeling like you've been abused in some fashion,
Yes. No, I get you. I mean, the Susan Hill's Woman in Black is one like that where...
Well, she's a huge inspiration for our film, because I was in correspondence with Susan Hill for a while after the Twilight era, because she saw it and really enjoyed it. That's the first film I did with Simon. Yeah. And she really enjoyed it. So we were literally in correspondence, emailing each other quite regularly. She'd tell me, oh, I'm doing this book now and I'm working on that. And what are you doing? And stuff like that. So it was very nice. And she gave me a lovely quote for that film. It's really kind of helped push it out there as well, because Susan Hill is a Woman in Black. Yeah. One of the most famous stories of all time. And of course, still running in the Fortune Theatre in the West End. Incredible. Yes. I saw it there its first year, actually, and was blown away by it. Yes. I've seen it many times since.
Yes. The TV version of it is particularly scary. That came out 10 years, 15 years ago.
Even earlier than that. That actually came out. You won't believe this. It came out almost 30 years ago.
Oh, that long. Oh, time goes.
I know.
Yes.
Almost 30 years. It really does fly by.
Yes.
Yeah, not a fan of the Hammer version, I have to say, with Daniel Radcliffe. I mean, I like Daniel Radcliffe. I think he's a very strong actor. It's nothing to do with him. It was overproduced, It was just all effects, and the woman herself wasn't scary, and it just got too much. The simplicity of the television version was what made it so horrific, and the stillness. Yes. Really, that's an excellent production. It really
you get people saying, and the scene in the bedroom, where she floats in. I mean,
oh my God.
Yes.
Absolutely. I remember, actually, you might have to cut this bit out of your podcast. Are you making edits? but I was with a brother and a friend, and the two of them were stoned out of their minds in this apartment on Morehampton Road in Dublin. And I put that on for them, knowing they were totally chilled in their stone. Yeah. And when that bit came on, they leapt out of their seats, crawling behind the furniture. It utterly blew their minds, but wanted to rewind it and keep watching it. Say rewind, of course. We're talking VHS, people. I know a lot of people listening are like, well, what's a VHS? Look it up. Yeah. But, with the crackles across the screen. And they just kept doing it. They were so stoned, they kept watching it over and over again, getting more freaked out by it. But it's true, the scene in the bedroom, yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
What was your interest? What sparked your particular interest in horror and the paranormal? You've clearly got an enthusiasm for it, as opposed to, hey, I can make money out of this. You're clearly enthusiastic about it. But I find most people, there's something in their background, there's something that's intrigued them from an early age.
Well, that's definitely it, Charles. Definitely. Growing up in Dublin in the 70s, we Dublin in the 70s, right on the edge of the Dublin mountains, this kind of cold, what some people consider a bleak landscape. To me, it was just this really atmospheric playground, growing up. For the first 7 or 8 years of my life, I had grown up in a place called Ranelagh, which is kind of like a village on the edge of the city, but did have a kind of a mixture feeling of a city and a village, So that was the introduction. But then when we moved out to the sticks, one of these little satellite commuter suburbs, one of the earliest ones actually, we moved out there in 1974. My dad was the only person with a car on the street, that kind of thing. And, we'd barely any furniture in the house, and just, the sound of the wind, hitting, coming right in off the mountains. And you could see the Hellfire Club right up on Montpelier Hill. And so you really started getting a sense of being very close to nature and the elements and a kind of an other world. So my brother Peter and I, especially, who were closest in age, only 18 months between us, we started getting this real interest in ghosts and the paranormal and stuff like that. And we started asking, for ghost books and that, Peter Haining and people like that.
Mm-hmm.
One of, Daniel Farson and stuff like that, which would have been one of our favorites as editors and writers as well. So we started collecting those books, reading. We'd be told to go to bed at 7:00, and then you'd immediately take out the dinner plate-sized torch under the eiderdown, and and wake up bleary-eyed, when you call for school the next morning. But it was just so worth it.
Yeah.
Because you'd had an amazing night the night before, delving into all of these ghost stories and listening to the howling wind, battering off the very thin window pane. Of course, no double glazing back in those days.
Yeah.
We'd wake up, in the winter, and there'd be ice on the inside of the glass.
Oh, yeah.
People now just don't. You've experienced that, have you?
Oh, yes. I lived in a house like that as well. And yes.
Well, that's great, though.
Jack Frost on the window. That was it. We used to call it.
But it makes a man of you, doesn't it? I mean,
it does indeed.
Nowadays everyone's cold. I'm
Yes.
not cold anymore because I grew up in a really cold house. So, I go in and somebody has a radiator on and I'm stripping down layers going, what's going on? And they're like, we're freezing. All right, okay. You didn't grow up the way I did then,
Yes.
in a tin bath in front of the fire, if you wanted a bath,
Yeah.
People think you make that up, but no, that was real life. So then what happened was suddenly, they started showing Lawrence Gordon Clark's incredible ghost stories for Christmas,
Yes.
at the BBC, and we were like hiding behind pillows, but there was always one eye looking out, watching
Yes.
everything that was happening. So you were, equally disturbed and equally euphoric, watching these incredible productions from the BBC. So, from the earliest age, right through my teens, I was continuing to devour all this incredible material. And, I discovered M.R. James and I discovered E.F. Benson, who people don't really think of as a ghost story writer, but wrote comparably good stories to M.R. James. But they were always set on a really hot day, which made them even creepier. And then people need to read Tales of an Empty House, the different anthologies, because they're incredibly creepy. He shows you ghosts that at times when you should never see one, on a really hot summer's day, and then suddenly you're confronted by something. So that whole mixture of, it doesn't have to just be the winter, it can be the summer, it can be anything, where something might just, break through the normality of a day or a situation or a place and bring something horrific into it, that you're not expecting. So I've always been interested in that kind of subtle horror of the paranormal. But when I started making films, for some reason, people kept advising me, you should go as extreme as you can because there's more of an audience there. And it never really felt right to me, but I started doing that, a lot of blood and gore. And, so they're films that, they've taught me how to make films, but I'd never watched them again.
Yeah.
They're films that I made, and they were a great experience at the time. But they're, it's almost like putting them in a time capsule and burying them somewhere and going, well, people can discover them again at some point if they like. As John said, you start making really successful films, and they start reappraising the stuff you did, because the stuff I did back then was, equally loved and equally despised. And I think that's the way it should be. I met Martin Scorsese once, and he said, you never want anyone to think of your film as,
Yes.
he said, you want them to love it or hate it.
Yes.
He said, because either way, you've invoked a very strong reaction with your work.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I wouldn't want my films to be hated by everybody. Then we've got a problem there. And he said, if you can go with the equal, he said, look at my gangs in New York. He said, have you seen how many 1-star reviews I got? So he's a funny guy, and he'd no problem talking about the stuff that he felt he didn't get quite right, So, when you're getting it from a great like Martin Scorsese, it kind of, relaxes you a little bit, and you realize that you're constantly evolving if you're a storyteller, and you're trying to do, great things. And I even said to my wife there recently, saying, it's a long old haul, isn't it, doing films? And I said, but my films have only really started being released since Christmas 2013, and ever since then, everything has been released.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, there's another film by Jason Figgis. Yeah, that'll definitely get a release. And it goes out there, and different producers coming to me asking me to get involved in anthology horror films. So at the point now, I've got 30 director credits on IMDb, so it's constantly building. But the area that, we're moving into now is, I've been writing a lot of very solid human stories and, dramatic situations that people find themselves in, which I think would be much more palatable to a universal audience. And but it also means that I can't talk about these names at the moment because we've been asked not to, but we're now attracting big household names. Hugely respected British actors and actresses who are reading the scripts and going, oh, yeah, I want to do that. I'll give you a letter of intent, help you raise your money. I love that, recently doing a film, and we've got 3 major British actors, who have come on board, people that I grew up absolutely adoring, and couldn't believe that they were getting back saying, oh, I loved your script. Yeah, of course I want to do that, So it is great when you suddenly hit a situation, not a situation, but a phase in your career where you feel you finally got it right.
Yes.
And you're going in the right direction now, the direction you always wanted to go in as a child, but you still had to make your way through the mire in order to come out the other side and realize, all right, I'm here now, and now let's march forward and start, doing good things. So yeah, but you're asking as well about the whole paranormal thing. I mean, I've had many experiences. I mean, I know a lot of people, they choose not to believe. I always think there's a slight arrogance with people who just out of hand say ghosts don't exist. The paranormal is nothing but the imagination. And I go, well, by saying that, you're telling me that the experiences I had were not valid, where they're very valid. I mean, even connected to film, I directed a documentary called Maverick in London, which I'm also very proud of, which was for Sky Arts, and it was about the King's Head Theatre in Islington. On Upper Street, which Dan Crawford started, etc. And a lot of huge people, with huge careers started there, like Gary Oldman turned up one day, an afternoon theatre and said, could he get on the boards? And Sid Golder, who worked there at the time, said, absolutely, let's see what you got, and it was Gary Oldman. He'd never had any training at all and didn't go on to further training. He just used his instinct as an incredible actor and a incredible human, that he was able to just tap into all these different emotions and make them real on camera and on stage. I think his Churchill is just mind-blowing. The Darkest Hour, I absolutely adore that film. I know he's a controversial figure, Churchill, but I hugely admire him. People can shoot me down if they want, but that guy, stopped fascism overrunning this part of Europe. I'm sorry. So, get a grip. So, you know what I mean? It's easier for people in retrospect to start thumbing their nose at him, but sorry, at the time we couldn't, we needed a Churchill. Make the hard decisions. Anyway, that's getting political. So, what am I saying? Yeah, so doing a Maverick in London at the King's Head Theatre. I'm there with my fiance, who's now my wife and the mother of my lovely daughter. And we went there because Dan and Stephanie Sinclair Crawford had seen The Twilight Hour at an event, and they hired me to direct this film because they loved The Twilight Hour. So it just happened at a time where I was leaving a long-term job as well. So it all kind of, happened just at the right moment. There was a whole change in management, and everyone was leaving the company, and I thought, I can't stay here. It's just not the same place that it was before. So just as I left, I got offered this job, and then it ended up getting offered another job by Sky One, 3 or 4 months later, which is brilliant. So it's sort of that roller coaster. Anyway, but so we go to the King's Head Theatre. They say, look, we're getting an apartment together for you, only a few doors down from the theatre, for the duration of the shoot, which was going to be 3 months of living in Islington, only because of the availability of the big names like Alan Rickman and Richard E. Grant and Joanna Lumley and people that we needed in the documentary. So we thought, great, we'll spend 3 months in London, no problem. So we stayed up in the attic, basically, which had been Katie Caston, their daughter's bedroom. And so there was you had to go, pull up the not the drawbridge. You had to go up the ladder and then pull up the ladder behind you, and then close down.
Yes.
All of that. And there were no doors, nothing like that. There was an area where they kept all the costumes for the plays at the back, and that was fine. So we're sitting there on the bed, chatting away, and I looked over Bee's shoulder, my wife, and there was a young girl standing in the doorway who looked like Alice in Wonderland. And she would totally looked flesh and bone, but her face was deathly pale. She'd ruby red lips, long black hair, wearing the black and white, outfit and the shiny shoes that you associate with Alice in Wonderland. I know a lot of people think of her as blonde. I've always thought of her as having dark hair. I think that's how she was written, as far as I know. Anyway, so this girl was standing there, and she was staring down at me with these black eyes, as if to say, "What are you doing in my room?" That kind of vibe, like, "Get out." Mm-hmm. So I turned to my wife and I said, "It's a girl standing in the doorway." And when I looked back, there was nobody there. And my wife was like, "Oh, don't give me that. You're just looking for stuff." I said, I wasn't thinking of some strange girl standing in the doorway. So I got up immediately and I ran out to the space. As I said, you couldn't close it. There was no door. It was only a doorway. And then I flicked on the light, and there were rows of costumes, and I searched through all the costumes, and the trapdoor was shut. Mm-hmm. So there was no way out. There was nowhere to escape to. So about a day later, I remembered to say it to Stephanie Sinclair. And I said, "Is the King's Head haunted?" And she goes, "Well, I've never had any experiences here." And she said, "I'll tell you what, there's a very close friend of mine who's a medium. And I'll invite her over for lunch for quite a while. So I'll see what she says." So anyway, a couple more days went by, and I hadn't really thought about it. I was interviewing Michael Winner, which was a trial in itself, as you can imagine. So I'd forgotten about everything at that stage. Then when I came back, Stephanie said, "Oh, Jason, would you come in here for a minute?" And I walked in, and there was this small woman, really dark, sitting in the corner, and she didn't stand up. And I walked over to her, and Stephanie said, "Oh, this is such and such." And I went over and I reached my hand down to take her hand, and she enclosed my hand in both of her hands and just stared at me and kept staring at me, and then squeezed my hand gently and smiled and said, "Very pleased to meet you." And I said, "Yeah, you too." And Stephanie just smiled, and I said, "I've got to go in here." When I walked out, I immediately knew it was the medium. Yes. I just got this feeling about her. So that night, Stephanie called me and my wife into the beautiful drawing room. Kind of, they had a big velvet curtains, and we sat around with the fire blazing and chatting. And she said, "That woman is the woman I was telling you about, the medium." And she said, "Well, I asked her if the King's Head is haunted." And she said, "Ooh, do you really want to know that?" and she said, "Because you live here." And she said, "Yes, I really want to know that, because the director has had an experience, and I'd like to know whether it's his imagination or wishful thinking, or is there something here?" And she said, "You've got two spirits here that are here all the time." And she said, "Oh, right." And she said, "The first is a young man that sits on the doorstep of the entrance to your flat with his face in his hands, and I can't make anything out about, and he's there constantly. And then the other one is a girl of around 11 or 12 years old with long black hair." So that was it. So she also said, when you left, she turned to me and said, "He has it. He has the vision for this."
Oh.
And she said, "I could feel it from him very strongly, that he has the ability to see behind the veil, of stuff that's there." So I got a shiver, as you can imagine. I thought, wow, because I've had so many, that was one of many things. I've had crazy things where, like the night that Princess Diana died, I had a dream that there was a headline on a newspaper, and it said, "Dodi Al-Fayed leaves Princess Diana." And then the next morning I woke up, and the first thing I did was turn on the radio, only to hear them saying Princess Diana has died. And I thought, like, why did I have that dream, So lot of stuff like that. I met Rex Harrison in a dream, only to find out the next morning that he died that night. It's like,
yeah.
So I get a lot of things like that, a lot of strange moments and synchronicities, and a lot of telepathy between my wife and I. I'd look at her and she'd say, "I know what you're thinking." Like people say that as a joke.
Yeah.
And she literally, we would share what we had been thinking at that moment. So it's, but is it paranormal? Like supernormal? What is it? Sometimes I think it's just a part of us that, because of civilization, has been dumbed down. It's been kind of covered with layers and layers of society. So we don't need to use it anymore. But back when humans roamed the earth first, they didn't have language. They had to be able to sense things and get a feeling from this person that they've just met on the moor. Are they dangerous? What is it? So, what is it really? So
yes,
it's very interesting though, to me.
It is. Yeah.
I have to say. And I'm not afraid of it. I'm not even vaguely afraid of it. Like my wife even says that I'll walk home through a completely dark park for 3 miles with no torch and just really enjoy the experience. And she cannot understand that. I would sit on a park bench at midnight, just relaxing, listening to the birds. And I've got no problem with that. I feel very much at home doing it.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Am I long-winded?
Not at all. Not at all. No, I'm conscious it's getting to a time when you're going to be needing to go out into the park and lurk and listen to the birds.
Exactly. Yes, into the night, into the dark. Exactly.
Listen to the children of the night.
Exactly. What sweet music they make. Exactly.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on. And I say I'm
Probably
conscious
is,
of the time going by. So, Jason, thank you ever so much for your time. Keep me up to date with the progress on Winifred Meeks.
I will indeed, absolutely.
Until the next time we're in touch, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charles. It's an absolute pleasure. And I love your podcast.
Oh,
I think it's
lovely.
fantastic.
Thank you.
I love it.
That's it. Time for me to go. But before I do, let's have a few final words from Robert Burns. These are the closing verses to his poem, To a Mouse, which is frequently recited at those Burns Night suppers some of you will be attending this weekend. And this, by the way, is an English translation from the original Scottish, so I won't try and abuse the Scottish language by using their accent. But mouse, you are not alone in proving foresight may be vain. The best laid schemes of mice and men go often askew, and leave us nothing but grief and pain for promised joy. Still, you are blessed compared with me. The present only touches you, but oh, I backward cast my eye on prospects dreary, and forward, though I cannot see, I guess and fear. Just remains for me to say thank you for listening, and I'll hope you'll join me again same time next week. Till then, this is Charles Christian saying goodbye.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @ChristianUncut. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.